We are back in action and ready to roll. And we're going to continue the conversation that Ken kicked off so brilliantly, talking about creativity and curiosity, that Malcolm unpacked so interestingly, talking about social adaptation and the challenge of taking people alongside the technological journey of change and how we get in our own way in so many instances. And I'm also going to invite onto the stage, and I'm going to welcome her first as well to the conversation, Dr. Vivienne Ming. I want to tell you a little bit about her before I invite her out. Dr. Vivienne Ming is an incredible theoretical neuroscientist, entrepreneur, and author. She co-founded Socios Labs, her fifth company, an independent think tank that is exploring the future of human potential. She is renowned across the globe. You will frequently see her cited in media ranging from the Financial Times to the New York Times and beyond. And I love this. In her free time, ladies and gentlemen, she's invented AI systems to help treat her diabetic son. She's predicted manic episodes in bipolar sufferers weeks in advance, and she's also reunited orphan refugees with extended family members. She's quite the extraordinary individual, and I'm thrilled to welcome her to the stage. Please join with me in giving an Energy Disruptors hand to Dr. Vivienne Ming. Welcome. And can you keep the applause going? Can I invite back to stage Sir Ken Robinson? Welcome, Ken. And joining Ken and Vivienne, can we welcome back Malcolm Gladwell? Welcome all. Please feel free to take a seat. Wonderful. What a panel to have to close our day and to really bring our conversation to light around the future of work and connecting so many of these threads that have run over the last 2 days around technology and human capability and how we move forward and what that means for each and every one of you as leaders in the room. Vivienne, I wanted to start with you. I'm interested to understand a little bit, human purpose and potential is so much of what has fueled your curiosity in life. I want to understand a little bit about why this is your passion to begin with, but what your research has taught you about the critical human factors, to focus the language that we certainly heard Ken pick up on before, the human potential. What do we learn about what it takes to maximise that?
Absolutely. I got to admit, I'd love to riff on 1,000 things that were said before I got on the stage. My very first ever machine learning project was doing real-time facial action coding for the CIA. We could tell whether you were lying, and now it powers the iPhone 10 and the Animojis. So my big lesson for all innovation ever is that $50 million worth of CIA funding and 20 years worth of grad student research now animates cats on your phone. Should be true for if you're in quantum computing or cold fusion, it doesn't matter. It's going to be cats in the end.
Yeah, I don't know about the ROI on that investment. Jeez.
So, I have a very unusual life story, and it taught me something about the value that people bring. There's this famous economist, Raj Chetty, who has this line of research, what he calls lost Einsteins. This amazing research, kids from wealthy backgrounds that really don't need the help, nonetheless are, if you match them for academic performance, are about 10 times as likely to get a patent in their lifetime, not than poor kids in the United States, middle-class kids. The poor kids doesn't even really compute. A wealthy kid with a lowest math quintile is slightly more likely to get a patent in their lifetime than a poor kid, the rich kid with the lowest math quintile, than a poor kid from the highest math quintile. And so if you just run the numbers, you realize that the people that are trying to solve some of the problems that we're talking about here, or some of the most crucial problems in medicine, maybe in politics and beyond, will never have the chance to live the life and be that person. The interesting thing for me is I was born that person and then ended up homeless. And it was a big climb to get back into that life. No one needs to shed a tear for me, but it was really illuminating that after spending several years living in a car and then going back and getting to do all the things you very kindly introduced me on, What if everybody had the chance to do stuff like that? So in my work, we get to use AI in wildly different ways than most other people do. For example, looking at human potential. If I could analyze the data of 100 million people and I get chances to do stuff like that, what's actually predictive, not of who Amazon will hire. That's simple. First, be male. That's a big help. Go to the right university, that's a big help. How do I know this? Because they tried to recruit me to be their chief scientist. But instead, what's really predictive, being creative. And that may sound like a philosophical statement, but I mean, I'm a hard number scientist. Turns out there are ways that psychologists measure creativity or resilience or collaboration and communication skills. And it turns out, if you wanted to know what your walking speed would be at age 65, how wealthy you might be, but also how many friends you might have, or try to predict what your insulin sensitivity or central body mass might be. There's all sorts of genetic factors that go on there, and there's a bunch of factors that are terribly causal, like the postal code you grew up in. But if you want to do the things that were under your control or society's in the way it interacts with you, it's whether you're resilient. It's whether you have good perspective-taking skills, whether your basic cognitive architecture was well developed when you were young. You give that to someone, and maybe some of these problems don't seem so dire anymore because instead of 1% of the world population trying to solve them, let's not go crazy. 10%, an order of magnitude more people. So we get to measure these things in massive data sets, from little kids to the elderly, and the things that are predictive of the best life essentially be more human.
It's interesting. And some of this I feel we've known for some time. Creativity, I feel, Ken, I mean, this has been your life's work. This is a conversation. You've been shaking government for some time saying we need to do a better job at fostering this. But as you point out, kind of the institutional design and the systems we're still putting people through is undermining really what we're seeking to create. Do we need to blow it up and start again? Can we pivot from where we are right now? How do we navigate the challenge?
Actually, it's not been my life's work, truthfully. I hate to contradict you at this point, Holly,
Go
in
for
the
it.
proceedings.
You can contradict me all you like.
No, but it's become a big focus, probably in the last 15 years or so. I had no idea what I was going to do when I was a kid. Absolutely none. I mean, I had a meeting when I was 16 with a careers advisor at school. I was living in, just outside Liverpool. And he said, what do you like? And I said, well, I like French at school. Actually, I like the French teacher, Mr. Evans. It's a long story. I like Latin and English. And he looked thoughtful. He said, have you thought of being an accountant?
You're kidding.
I said, curiously not, no. And I actually went on to do an arts degree, and I trained as a teacher. But when I left college, I didn't know what to do. I'd applied for two things. One was to do a PhD, because I thought that sounded interesting. It was just a personal Everest to climb. The other one was I'd applied to teach English in Stockholm, because I was appalled by the plight of all these Swedish young women who couldn't speak English. And
you took it as your personal responsibility to teach them, didn't you?
If it should fall to me, No, I just fancied the idea of getting out of the country for a bit, truthfully, and going to Europe. I mean, nowadays, it's not quite so fashionable when you live in England, but but I didn't know, and I got a studentship, to do the PhD. And I started to move in that direction. Now, the reason I'm saying it is not because I think you should be interested in my life, but one of the best pieces of evidence of creativity for all of us is our own biography. Every single human life is different. I mean, how many of you are now doing exactly what you thought you'd be doing when you were 15? So it's improbable, isn't it?
Not one.
You see, when we come to write our resumes for the interviews that Malcolm refuses to have now, but when you come to do that, you try to put a kind of structure, a narrative on your life. So you pick out all the key dates and you put some things in bold and some things in italic and get it onto two sides of paper. And you're trying to make it look as if you've been fulfilling this strategy that you'd figured out when you were younger. Because the last thing you want to do is to convey the actual chaos that you're living through, because it's a constant process of improvisation. And that, to me, is the best evidence. I did an event a few years ago in Vancouver with the Dalai Lama. It was a peace summit. It was called the Vancouver Peace Summit. You're very good at titles in Canada. This is the thing I've discovered. But he said lots of wonderful things. And one of the things he said was to be born at all is a miracle. So what are you going to do with your life? And the fact is, what we make of our life has everything to do with our resilience. I think you're exactly right, discovering these human qualities. I got interested in all this because I got interested in the arts originally, drama in particular. I found it personally interesting. And then I was very struck by the fact that the arts are low down the food chain in education. I wondered why that was, and that's what the PhD was about. And then some years later, I did a lot of work around that. Then some years later, Tony Blair, do you remember Tony Blair? When Tony Blair was Queen in England, when he became Prime Minister, he said he wanted to promote creativity in education for economic reasons and so on. And I thought, well, that's great, but the system doesn't do that. And it doesn't do it because it wasn't designed to do it. The system currently is designed to promote a certain type of intelligence. And this always struck me from the beginning that we have come to conflate, for cultural reasons, we've come to conflate academic ability in particular with intelligence in general. And it's not the same thing. Intelligence is much more diverse and multifaceted than the capacity for that type of deductive reasoning. But along the way, we've stereotyped the arts and the sciences. I mean, I didn't do particularly well at mathematics at school. It wasn't my thing. I blame the teacher, obviously. But I think Vivienne would agree with this, that mathematics, properly conceived, is one of the most deeply creative disciplines at our disposal. And I know this from having spoken to a lot of mathematicians about it. I once asked a professor of pure mathematics at the university I went on to teach at how you would assess a PhD in pure mathematics. I mean, I'd never seen such a thing. Actually, the first thing was, I said, how long are they? PhD in pure math. I used to supervise PhDs in the humanities, and we had a word limit of 80,000 words, which is important because people had to be stopped, and like enough, on the French subjunctive. So I said, how long is a PhD in pure maths? And he said, well, they vary. He'd seen one a few weeks before this conversation. He said it was about 15 pages long. 15 pages of math, page after page of math, with equals at the end, I imagine.
Yeah. Fortuitous ending for an equation.
Thankfully, happily ever after, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking hard math, obviously. We're talking remainders and things like that. So I said, how do you judge one? I mean, presumably it's right. You'd be pretty irritated, wouldn't you? Just 5 years doing a PhD in pure math, it comes back wrong. See me. So I said, how do you judge it? And this is the thing that fascinated me. He said there are two criteria. And the first is it's how original it is. In other words, how creative it is. I don't mean how fanciful, but whether it extends our understanding in a new direction. But the second I absolutely loved, he said, it's aesthetic. And I said, why does that matter? He said, because mathematicians take the view that mathematics is one of the purest ways we have of describing the truths of nature. And since nature is inherently beautiful, the more elegant the proof, the more likely it is to be true. That elegance is an informal test of truth in mathematics. And most mathematicians I've spoken to agree with that. But he could have been talking about a sonata or a symphony or a piece of poetry. And so I have just long been interested in our capacity for making meaning and how that works and how diverse it is in the way that we do it. But latterly, I think it's become more and more important because these capacities, as I was saying earlier, are central now to how we should see our future. But the system was never designed to encourage them, and it's why it doesn't. And we have bred into ourselves a very narrow view of intelligence and a stereotypical view of how the disciplines operate. And really what I'm trying to do is to get this system to reconfigure around a more subtle understanding of how our intelligence works. And it's why it's so important, I think, to understand its relation to artificial intelligence, which is not the same thing.
Absolutely. Malcolm, this is a lot of what you unpacked in Outliers, looking at kind of the debunking this notion that it's all down to raw talent and hard work that makes success. And you mentioned as well, and it kind of picks up the point that you finished with there, this notion of opportunity and who we give good opportunity to. How do you think about that predictive skilling and the talent and capability we need to be ensuring we're educating people with to set them up for success?
These are not easy questions. Quite demanding. Being asked.
You thought you'd finished, didn't you?
So, I was so mesmerized. I was. Why don't you just let those guys go? Well, you can answer this a number of different ways, but you were talking about Raj Chetty's Lost Einstein's work, and we actually know that you can do things. I remember there was an economist recently, a group of economists who looked at, in the United States, who tried to answer the question: if we look at people who score in the 90th percentile or above on aptitude tests, and who are in the 20th percentile or below in family income, how many are there in a given year graduating from high school? And the answer is there's, I think, 35,000. So these are very intellectually able poor kids. And how many of those 35,000 go to a reasonably selective university? And the answer is, I think it's like 15,000. Mm-hmm. And so there are 20,000 highly gifted poor kids who are essentially not developing there. Now that's a very, very crude number. That's probably a massive, massive underestimate. But it gives you a sense of the scale of the kind of lost, of the scale of the lost opportunity. And it goes back to something I was talking about earlier in my one-on-one with you, Holly, that we are in a stage, and we've been trapped in a model which suggests that talent is scarce. And when you have a model that says talent is scarce, then it makes sense to invest heavily in a very small number of elite institutions, right? But once you understand that that model is profoundly wrong, and that far from being scarce, talent appears to be kind of everywhere, then you need to flip the model. You have to move away from this kind of all-star system and move instead towards much more kind of, a much greater equality of resource distribution in the educational sphere. Canada, where we are now, is much, much closer to that ideal than the United States. But I even worry that Canada is moving in the direction of more concentration of resources at the top and away from the egalitarian model that held sway in the 70s. I'm a product of Canada in the 70s, and I know what that quite flat system looked like. And I thought it was fantastic, and it laid the groundwork for this country's extraordinary achievements over the last 30 years. The last thing this country should be doing is aping the mistakes of its larger but by no means more
think carefully.
Fill in the adjective you want, neighbor to the south.
Vivienne, I want to pick this up with you too, and you can jump in on and finish the thought you wanted to have there, but I also wanted to ask you about your work, because one of your observations you're making about AI is that on the whole, you're very concerned about the lack of diversity of people behind it, and your observation at the trend we're on at the moment is that almost every bit of AI we're seeing is inequality increasing. I'd love you to touch on that as well as finish your thought there.
Yeah, in fact, I want to be even more provocative.
Great.
Technology itself is fundamentally inequality increasing. And that may sound like not the message Silicon Valley wants to sell, but it's not because technology is in some sense bad. It's because the people that are best able to make use of it are the ones that need it the least. I've had a couple of educational technology companies. Our vision was we're going to change education for all those kids that need it. Those weren't our customers. Our customers were, hyper-obsessed parents that wanted to get just a tiny increase in their test scores to make certain, God forbid, their kids went to Brown instead of Princeton. We see this actually, the phenomenon of kids, particularly, let's talk about the United States, high-performing kids from underrepresented backgrounds going so far as getting a full scholarship to these elite universities. So we're even taking, financially speaking, access off the table. and at rates you never see in the standard kid, read, wealthy white male, they don't take the scholarship. They got great grades in school. And you go talk to them. Do you think you could pass the classes? Of course I can. Do you think you could graduate from MIT? Hell yes. So why didn't you go? And just a few years ago, the paper came out that I felt finally did a rational answer to that. Instead of this sort of armchair philosopher, well, black families are different, or Hispanic families, it's culture, it's economics. They finally did this comparison where they compared kids that took it to kids that didn't. And what they found is there was nothing different between them. In fact, the only variable of dozens and dozens they looked at, which was a strong predictor of the kid taking the scholarship versus not, is that someone from their neighborhood went before them. They had an existence proof that their hard work would actually pay off. And as I read it, what was going through my head is exactly what I just said, the Hispanic kids and black kids. And then I realized, this is my dad. My dad grew up in nowhere, Kansas. Dorothy has never heard of the town he's from. And he graduated top of his class for the entire state in 1957. I got full scholarships everywhere and went to KU instead because of the words in my grandparents, what's the point? What's the point of going to some technical school halfway across the continent? Be the smart kid on the farm, but go to KU. So he went to KU, he tutored Wilt Chamberlain in chemistry, the famous chemist. And he always regretted that he was never the person that he could have been. Now, I'm talking about a straight white man, and you understand that these things really generalize fundamentally to being human, and whether you believe, given what society gives you back for your effort, is my effort mean anything? So yeah, this is particularly problematic. Again, back to the AI, the CIA lie detection, I saw the first ever demo of the real-time lie detection system, face tracking system developed by a guy named Paul Viola at MIT. It was amazing. Hold up a dollar bill, my funny green one, and it tracks George Washington. I take a photo of this audience, and it finds every face. And then he shows the crew of the Enterprise. And it misses one person. And I bet you could guess who. It misses Uhura. And he jumps ahead, and me being a snooty undergrad, I force him to go back and explain. And he says, it's not our fault. We train this on the internet. The internet's overwhelmingly white. We use a kind of technology known as a Haar wavelet cascade. I'll test you on it later. And it just is very sensitive to luminance issues. We got this. We're going to fix it. Flash forward 10 years. I get a call from the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Ming, Google just labeled a black couple as gorillas. Is AI racist? I said, it's pretty much like the rest of us. It depends on how you raise it. I've spent time with that team at Google. We got it. We know what went wrong. We've seen the photo. I've seen it. I understand technically what went wrong. I'm not going to go into the technical, but ask me later. Flash forward 10 more years, and now there's this professor at MIT that's demonstrating that real-time face recognition systems that are being used for police, border control, they're being used in interviews. By the way, I love this. I won't name the person, but the global head of AI, global head of recruiting for one of the biggest companies in the world, that was customers of one of my companies, went through the process of what they did in recruiting and hiring people. And it was essentially the following. So we do this, and we know we shouldn't. And then we do this, and we know we shouldn't. And then we do this, and then we know we shouldn't. Then we do an interview, and then we know we shouldn't. And we did it all because we didn't know what else to do. And if we don't do anything, they'll fire us. So interviews, turns out, don't predict anything about job performance. And yet we do them because otherwise we'd fire the head of HR. So we have all of these things. It's now 20 years since the first time I saw a real-time demo of this AI system that could track faces, and it still can't see black people. There's a sitcom on for a while. I don't know if anyone ever saw it because it was very short-lived, called Better Off Ted. And it had this one episode where they build a face recognition system to open all the doors for the employees. So you don't have to badge in and out, which is a pain in the ass if you've ever been in a big company. So it's great, and they launch it, and all the black employees are trapped in their offices because it won't recognize them and you let them out, which I thought, wow, how did they know? But then the best part was the solution, because it felt so real to me. They hired a bunch of white interns to follow the employees around and open the doors for them. And again, boy, could I see that being the solution inside a company. So, this is 20 years of machine learning. Before deep neural networks have come along, before the recent revival, all of it, the same problem. It's not a technical problem. We could see black people if we wanted to. I don't mean that as a metaphor, but take that too. It is, in fact, ultimately, the nobody working on these problems is afraid that their relatives are going to get labeled as gorillas. And it's just not a high priority. They're not bad people, but they're simply trying to solve a problem and get a product out the door, and it just isn't meaningful and relevant to them.
Ken and Malcolm, I'd be interested for your views too on the moment in time that we're in, and your take on whether we risk rising inequality, and if so, what it is we can do to be intentionally, again, as leaders, having a collective responsibility, I think, to kind of an underlying thread, the agency that we have to control how this future plays out in this moment in time, if we choose to take it with both hands. What is it that we can be doing to make sure we don't see rising inequality?
Well, I was just trying to remember those misfires with technology. This happened with voice recognition systems quite early on. I remember writing a sentence in a book that said, the foundations of the modern intelligence test were laid in the late 19th century by Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, which is true. And the voice recognition system changed that because it disliked the passive voice. And the sentence that came up was, in the late 19th century, Sir Francis Galton laid a cousin of Charles Darwin. The foundation of the modern intelligence test. So we do have to be vigilant. The thing is, I completely want to support what Malcolm was saying earlier about talent. Talent is everywhere. And it's like with facial recognition. It's our failure to see it that's the problem. We shouldn't doubt that it exists. I mean, for example, in the current education system in America, where I live, it depends what day of the week you ask and how you put the question, but roughly speaking, about 15% of kids on average who start the 9th grade in high school don't complete the 12th grade.
Wow.
A very large proportion of people in the prison system in America did not complete high school. This is not the same thing as saying that if you don't complete high school, you end up in jail. But it is true, a lot of people in jail didn't complete high school. Many of them are people of color, but not all. But this huge proportion of people who leave high school early is a tragedy for them and for the country. Now, I always want to avoid the word dropout, because to call somebody a dropout makes it sound like they failed the system. But if you're losing between 15 and 20% of your client base every year, if this was your company, you might wonder whether these stupid clients or your business model. And this, to me, is a fundamentally important issue because, I was talking earlier about my granddaughter, but and how kids love to learn. There's a difference, isn't it, between learning, education, and school. Children love to learn. Learning is about acquiring new skills and understanding, and they love to do that. Education is an intentional system of learning. It's one way to think of it. And it's based on the premise that there are some things that we want children to learn or people to learn that they may not learn of their own accord. They may not just come across it. Or it may be too difficult, and they need help, like calculus. It's unreasonable to ask the average 8-year-old to go and figure out calculus, since only 2 people in history did, and they were grown-ups. So I'm all for education. I always remember when I was a student, we used to have these earnest debates about the difference between education and training. Training is a skill-based activity, and the issue became a lot clearer when as we discussed it. We said that most parents would be quite happy to know that their children had sex education at school. If they'd had sex training, not so much. School is a community of learners, as I see it. Just that, it's a community of learners where people come together to learn with and from each other. And that is incidentally how we learn. We don't learn in a vacuum, we learn from the people around us. As Malcolm was saying earlier, we used to learn in quite small communities, now we live in global communities. Much of what we learn from other people. Most of us know only a very small fraction of the ideas and systems that we depend on every day to work. We live in these very tight-knit nets of ideas and of systems, deeply collaborative. So why is it that people who love to learn, as so many kids do, don't get on very well in education? It seems to me astonishing that we entertain the idea that people can fail in education, that they can fail education. And why is it that so many have a really bad time with school? It isn't kids, it's the way we've come to do school. For historical reasons, it's preoccupied with a certain view of understanding. It's based on this linear idea that you need to get to Princeton, not Brown. It's engendered this massive system of testing in all of our countries, not just in this. I did, by the way, I did a book a few years ago called Creative Schools about what the alternatives look like. And we did some numbers. I'd like to, by all means, check them out, but this is what we found out at the time, that in 2013, the National Football League in America, which incidentally is not football. I'm just saying, it's rugby in armor. Because in football, you kick the ball with your foot. Anyway, we now have to call this soccer.
It's a tragedy.
But the NFL was a $9 billion industry, so to speak, as a sector. The US cinema domestic box office the same year was an $11.3 billion sector. The education, testing, and support industry was a $16 billion business. All of it farmed out to the private sector. States are spending millions of dollars every year on something that didn't work. And it's shoring up this linear idea that if you go to college and get a degree, you'll have a job for life. It's an old idea. Something that Malcolm has been brilliant about for so long is knowing how to tell stories and how to tell a different story. And this is a story we need to retell. People are growing up still with the belief that if you do everything right, if you have a narrow education at school, if you sit at a desk and do essays, and then you get to a good college, everything will be fine. Your life will go on, as planned, and the whole world will, get back onto an even keel. It's a profoundly mistaken message now, and a profoundly misleading one. But I think we have the tools at our disposal to put this right if we have the will to do it. I mean, when we talked about Uber earlier, it's very interesting, isn't it, that 10 years ago, certainly 15, you were saying in the 90s, but I guess 15 years ago, that's right. Uber was inconceivable. It wasn't inconceivable just to get in an Uber, the business was inconceivable. It was only made possible by the ubiquity of mobile devices, with GPS, with instant online credit card transactions, and so on. The technology gave rise to the idea and made it feasible. It's like rock music had to wait for electrification before people could really think about it as an idea. And now we have these extraordinary businesses made possible by the technology. I do think it's possible to personalize and customize and diversify education now in ways that we couldn't previously, with the aid of the technology, not solely through the technology. I mean, one example is most kids go through school in age groups. There's no good reason to do that. Really, we don't do it outside school. When kids leave school in the afternoon, they're not sent off to compounds that are organized by age groups. 8-year-olds mix freely with 12-year-olds. Bad things don't happen if we do that. There's every case to have a multi-age approach to education. There's no reason why kids can't have individual timetables. Now, it used to be difficult because it was all being put together with somebody with a pencil and an eraser, and now it's not. So the technology can really help to disrupt the model, and I think it's our next big horizon, really. There was a great quote by H.G. Wells, one of the few people who's really solid, I think, at looking into the future. But he said in the early 20th century that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And I don't think that's overcalling it. As we start to figure out our relationship with these new technologies and the problems that we've created, we have to think differently about talent and how we cultivate it. And I think we have the tools to do it, but we can't really wait a generation to figure out how that's going to work, I think.
Absolutely. Malcolm?
I was very struck by the observation that technology is an engine of inequality. But it doesn't have to be, right? So that's the thing, and that's what's interesting. Because I was thinking about, so you can think of a good example of it being an engine of inequality would be, I think we're about to enter into a period in medicine of massive inequality because there'll be a series of incredibly effective genetic-based treatments that will be insanely expensive. And you're going to have a situation with so that's a kind of one end of the continuum. But the other end would be, I had this fascinating conversation with a chess grandmaster recently. And when he was a kid, in order to be good, you had to play at a tennis club, and at a chess club, at a chess club. And so he came from a well-off family, and he was homeschooled. And his mom would drive him into New York from the suburbs so he could play at one of those clubs in the village. And that's why. So you had to be wealthy to have that opportunity. And now they all play Puzzle Rush, right? Tens of millions of people around the world who only need a cell phone. And they can now play with anyone in the world and and their access to expertise in this area has been radically democratized by the combination of very, very cheap screens and a program that presents a series of chess puzzles to would-be players. So the question is, how can we have more puzzle rushes and fewer, expensive gene therapy treatments? How can we kind of reorient? And I think, following up on your observation, that the logic of the marketplace is often towards the inequality improving technology, equality increasing technologies. So there has to be some way we can kind of hack the system to get it more interested in puzzle rushes. And I don't really have a good answer to that, but I sort of think that would be a very useful goal to have.
Well, I think the point here, though, is to bridge everything that we're talking about, which is understanding these technologies. I wouldn't build the stuff I build if I didn't believe that they could do good in the world. Again, when my son was diagnosed with diabetes, being able to go in and hack his devices, as it turns out, breaks several federal US laws, and build the first ever AI for diabetes. And that's a shock. This was 8 years ago now. Why was I the first person to ever build an AI for diabetes? It's a multi-billion-dollar market. Why hadn't ever anyone done it before? And instead it was just some mom by circumstance. Seems kind of nuts. But you start to mix the human and the technology together. Understand that you can make amazing technologies available to people, but will they actually choose to use it? Or use it in the way that you envision it being used, which I think is a lot of maybe some of the downfall of social media in many ways, is you could use it in all sorts of ways. You could have deep conversations. I'm sure many people do, but most of us don't. In fact, it degrades conversation for many people, but that's a choice. Here's the craziest, most mad scientist thing I'm doing right now, which happens to be my job title, is we're working in neuroprosthetics, so cyborgs. In fact, when I interviewed for grad school, I went around telling people I wanted to build cyborgs, and they would literally scoot away from me for fear that my crazy would rub off, and they wouldn't get in either. But when I talk about this, so can I literally jam something in your brain and make you smarter? It would be totally clear. The answer is unambiguously yes, for those of you that survived the surgery. But we have these non-invasive technologies. I'm not going to sell the company, so forgive me for not mentioning them, but one of them just has a little patch. You throw it on your head. Anyone know the old Simon game where there's a pattern of lights and numbers, lights and sounds, and you have to get it in the right? If you're young enough that you don't know what I'm talking about, fuck you. I've never liked young people. It sucks because all of my employees are young people. So it turns out you throw this patch on your head, and if you could do about a 7th length sequence before, just like that, you can do 9. So you're about 20% smarter in this one single way, working memory span, which turns out, actuarially speaking, not for a single person, but a large population of people, a 20% increase in working memory span is about $30,000 US in increased annual earnings. you're substantially more likely to live longer. Turns out people with larger working memory spans have better diets. So interesting positive benefits. Who do you think the early adopters will be? It's not kids with small working memory spans from rough neighborhoods that need a little extra help. It's going to be those same parents that want to get a little extra boost. So you'll start seeing kids show up with these patches on their head for their SATs and their ACTs and all the other standardized exams, and it will help them. What's interesting is the only reason I'm doing it is for kids with traumatic brain injury. So you're confronted with this pretty fundamental trade-off, which is, again, the people that can exploit it the best probably need it the least. And you have to think so much more than just, we've got this amazing technology that can allow me to place an order on the other side of the continent, but really think creatively, how would humans actually interact with this technology? There's only messy human problems. They only ever have messy human solutions. And if you're not comfortable with that, you cannot see what might be coming in the future or how these things would play out.
I feel like you've all done a really good job of unpacking some of the enormous challenges and opportunities that exist at this period of time. I wonder if I can, as we bring the session to a close, ground us back in what it is that each and every one of us as leaders, and I use that inclusive of every single person in this room, can do to positively make a difference in our own sphere of influence to the way this conversation plays out. Because I feel like sometimes when we talk about issues like AI, the state of education, culture and innovation, it can almost feel so large it's paralysing. Or it can feel so abstract it's difficult to conceive how we can play a role individually in that conversation. I'd love if each of you could give us a parting thought, a bit of advice or a provocation for what it is you'd like our audience to take forward and think about in terms of the contribution they can make and how they can show up differently in the way they engage in this. Ken, maybe you can go first.
No. Yeah, I think there are two things, really. One is that as you were talking about earlier when you were talking to Malcolm, is that people often don't have the information at their disposal that they need to think about these things in the right way. We're privileged in various ways to have these sort of conversations, but not everybody makes their business or is in the position to do it. That's the first thing. We have to be better at communicating these things, and to talk across sectors and not just within our own particular area of interest. The other thing, though, is I think it is very important to realize that systems do change, and they can change, and it's the sum of individual actions. I mean, Greta Thunberg is showing us that again at the moment, that a single individual can help to kickstart a movement. Things do change. It's often hard to spot quite how the change has happened, but I think in my own lifetime, I mean, in the 70s, for example, everybody I know smoked. Everybody. And now, if somebody was to light up a cigarette here, you'd be outraged. I used to sit on platforms like this having a cigarette, and we'd be swapping them. It's just because it was just okay to do that. I mean, culture's about that. It's about permission. It's about where the boundary for permission is and where it changes. What happened in the US recently is the boundaries of permission have changed, have oscillated over 3 presidencies. And you see it happening. People get the cue that this is okay or this isn't okay. I mean, for example, over the past, I think it's a very good thing, but in the past 5 years or more, every state in the Union of the United States has passed legislation approving same-sex marriage. And absolutely right. What was interesting to me about it, though, was in most cases it was pretty uncontroversial. People said, yes, can we just do this now? In the 70s, it was unthinkable. I mean, I grew up in England. I lived through the sexual revolution, as you can see.
In Sweden.
Exactly. Exactly.
Too right.
I mean, I didn't go out that weekend, as it turns out, but I could see people were moving differently. But then it was unthinkable. I mean, same-sex marriage was unthinkable. And same-sex relationships were illegal, mostly. But over the course of this period, people have said, this is fine. Catholic Ireland, my wife is from Ireland, Catholic Ireland was the first state in the European Union to allow same-sex marriage. It's also banned smoking in public houses in Ireland. So if you went into a coma and went back to Ireland, you could find yourself in a pub surrounded by same-sex couples who can't smoke, because the boundary has shifted for the good. Now, what I'm saying is cultural change does happen, and it's the sum of individual actions that start to mount up. So I think it's, however big these problems are, I think we have to recognize they're manifested in what we ourselves do. And we shouldn't be waiting for other people to do it. I often say to people who work in schools, if you're a teacher, for the kids in your classroom, you are the system. It's not some remote figure, it's you. And so if you change what you do, you change the world for them. If you're a parent, if you change the way you approach them, you change the world for them. So it's within all of our grasp to do something. And I feel optimistic because I think there's enough energy moving in this direction at the moment that if we become part of it, it will grow to something more powerful. I mean, we have to be circumspect, but I do think we have created this world, we can recreate it.
I love that. Malcolm.
I thought I'd give a very narrow response to the question. I think that if, I want to make the case for randomizing everything. I sort of think at the root of a lot of what we're talking about is when you have technological change, the question is how do you allocate it? And the mechanisms we have now for the allocation of the benefits of technological change are either market-driven or they're market-driven in the sense that those who can access them easiest and pay the most for them get them. And there's no particular reason why we have to do it that way. And I've always been a huge fan of having lotteries for everything. I never understand, for example, why when you pass a very popular bar at night and there's a long line and half the people will never get in, why do people persist in that kind of system, which is sort of crazy? Why don't you just have a lottery and then, if the place can take 100 seats, the 100 people who win the lottery win. Similarly with any kind of selective institution or access to some kind of new technology, why do we insist on pretending that we can allocate them fairly or that the market will do a good job? And sometimes the market can, but sometimes we just have a lottery, right? But that principle that it's totally fine to allocate social goods through random means. There's nothing, unfair or hostile to democratic structures or in any way. No, it's a perfectly legitimate way to allocate privilege in society. And I think maybe now that we are entering into a new age where there's a whole different kind of privilege that's about to be invented, that's being invented all around us, then I think we should explore this idea of different ways of more inventive ways of allocating it.
Interesting.
I'd love
Vivienne.
to talk to you about an idea my wife and I had along how should admissions go for elite universities. They already have a lottery. Everyone that goes to Harvard won the lottery of having wealthy parents that went to Harvard. So, so I talked about this research that predicts life outcomes. There's just a big cluster of things that we found that are predictive. And for lack of a better word, but it sort of resonates with a lot of what Ken has talked about, we call it meta-learning, learning to learn. That's what seems all of these qualities have in common, is whatever the world is 10 years from now, the one guarantee I can give you is I don't know what it will be. How do you build people for the unknown? You build learners so that the unknown, when they're there, is not unknown to them. So one of the more prominent constructs, forgive me for being wonky, that we find in meta-learning is purpose. Now, purpose probably does not sound like something you could measure. But again, psychologists can measure anything, and the way they typically measure construct strength of purpose is with surveys. They give you big surveys to lots of people, and they try and find consistent patterns in those survey responses, and they map it into outcomes. And it turns out surveys have, survey research on purpose has these very strong predictive validity. People that score higher on meaningfulness in their life and a sense of purpose, imagine everything you would want to be true about you in age 65, they've got it. And it's almost certainly causal. So I don't do surveys. I build little AIs. And we've done a lot of very ethically obscure projects with those AIs, like watching people in real time across a company of 500,000 people. So if I'm watching you all the time and measuring everything you're doing, what is the behavioral correlate that best predicts those surveys? Your sense of purpose. Let me pause by just saying purpose. What is it? It's something that's bigger than you. It's something that takes more than a lifetime to complete. The way I always love it is the world gets better when old men plant trees. They're never going to rest under the shade of that tree. It's not for them. It's fundamentally for someone else. So what did we measure? What did we find was the best predictor of these surveys? Sacrifice. When people took actions for which they would never reap a direct benefit, their life got better. And it's a paradox. Essentially what I'm saying is, you run a big race, and the people that stop to help the other racers are the people that end up winning, which doesn't make any sense. It's supposed to be rational self-interest, right? You're supposed to only care about yourself, let everyone else work it out, and yet, from the individual to the community to the company, and now we're looking macroeconomically in our own work, this seems to be a fundamental. People that make sacrifices have better lives. And the problem, it brought up the issue of authenticity earlier, and that's a term that gets used a lot, and I think gets washed out as, branding, and people try and take notes. Okay, so how should I be authentic? And it just doesn't, they don't get it. If you want to do something truly meaningful, if you want an amazing life, I'm not saying that there's a simple recipe, but I'm saying if you're not willing to make sacrifices, you will never find it. And neither will society. If you want an amazing life, you have to give it to someone else.
Wow, what a note to end on. Three great things for us to think about. The notion Ken raised there around starting from where you are right now in the role that you see yourself in and the capability to have change and influence. Malcolm's suggestion we think about randomisation as a principle in general for how we divide particularly social good and benefit. And finally, that call to think about sacrifice and to be what sacrifice are we making and who are we sacrificing for. Energy Disruptors, I think we have had an extraordinary final session. They've had such a wide-ranging conversation, such an extraordinary set of topics unpacked. Can you join with me in giving an enormous round of applause to our three panelists as we say thank you for the conversation. Thank you all so much.